Welcome back, dear listener. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here before, it's so lovely to have you back. Wherever you are right now, whether you're tucked beneath a heavy duvet, stretched out on a sofa with the world finally quieting down around you, or perhaps lying in the soft dark with your phone on the pillow beside you, I want you to take a slow, easy breath. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your hands go loose and open. Whatever today asked of you, it can wait. Right now, there is nothing to do, nowhere to be, and no problem that cannot wait until morning. Tonight, we are going somewhere very old, very beautiful, and wonderfully still. We are going to Prague, to the ancient quarter of the city, where the cobblestones are so worn smooth by centuries of boots and carts that they almost glow in the lamplight, where the rooftops press against one another like old friends, and the evenings have a quality to them that feels both slow and eternal. We're going to find a very particular door, a small, carved wooden door set into a wall of golden stone, and behind it, a world that smells of honey and warm wax, of herbs and old timber, of something rare and good and handmade.
So settle in.
Let your eyes close if they want to, and let me take you there. There is a time in Prague, and you have to catch it right, because it lasts perhaps only 20 minutes, when the sky is not yet dark, but the daylight has already begun to retreat from the streets. The sun has slipped below the rooftops on the western bank of the Vltava River, and the city holds its breath for just a moment between what was and what will be. The old town, called Staré Mesto in Czech, which simply means the old town, though to call it simply old is to enormously understate the thing, has been gathering people and stories for over 1,000 years. Its streets were already winding and busy before the first stone of Charles Bridge was ever laid, before Emperor Charles IV made Prague his imperial seat in the 14th century, before the great astronomical clock on the old town square was built in 1410 with its extraordinary mechanical figures that still move on the hour, every hour, to this day. You walk these streets, and you are walking, whether you know it or not, where medieval merchants walked, where monks walked, and guild masters and kings. The cobblestones underfoot are not decorative. They mark the actual paths that ordinary life has worn into the earth over more than 10 centuries of being alive. The city began as a marketplace, a crossing point over the Vltava River, a gathering place for traders who came from all directions across Central Europe. Guild workshops and craft houses flourished here, fed by the trade routes that the river made possible. The narrator has no map. They're simply walking and watching and letting the streets lead them where they will. This is, as it turns out, the very best way to find things in Prague. The lanes here twist and double back in ways that no grid-planned city would allow. They turn unexpectedly, open into small hidden squares, then close again into passages barely wide enough for two people to pass. The oldest preserved building in Old Town Prague is said to date back to around 1100, and the streets themselves follow patterns laid down long before that. If you closed your eyes and listened, you could almost hear the city humming with all of that layered time, centuries pressed together like pages in a very old book. The light is changing now. The violet blue of early dusk is settling into something darker, richer. And that is when the narrator notices the glow. It comes from beneath a low archway, warm, amber, flickering slightly, not the flat, steady light of electricity, but something older and softer. Something that moves. The narrator stops, tilts their head, follows it, and there, tucked between a pharmacy and a building whose facade carries carvings of grapes and leaves from some century-long past, is a door. The door is not what you would call large. It reaches perhaps to the narrator's chin, not so low that you must stoop dramatically, but low enough that you would have to step with a certain humility to enter. It is made of dark wood, oak perhaps, darkened with age and polished by the hands of generations. The wood grain runs in long, slow curves, like the lines of a sleeping face. But it is the carvings that hold the attention. Across the upper lintel, the horizontal beam above the door, someone many years ago has carved a series of small, precise images.
Bees.
Dozens of them, rendered with extraordinary care, their wings spread and detailed, their bodies rounded and true. Between the bees, flowers, not any flower in particular, but the kind of simplified, essential flower that an artisan carves when they are trying to capture the idea of flower rather than any single species. And at the very center of the lintel, above everything, a candle flame. Not a candle, just the flame itself, upright and elongated and beautiful, like a leaf made of light. Beneath the door, at the very bottom of the frame, a thin line of amber light seeps from within. And from within, unmistakable, warm, complex, the smell of beeswax and something honeyed and herbal and deeply, deeply comforting. In medieval Prague, workshop signs and carved guild symbols were a serious business. Before widespread literacy, the carved emblems above a craftsman's door told the world who worked within and what they made. The candle guilds, called chandlers in the English and French traditions, where they were formally organized by the 13th century, marked their spaces with symbols of their trade. Beeswax, in particular, was a material of prestige. It was more expensive than the tallow rendered from animal fat that most common households used. Beeswax burned cleanly, without the acrid, unpleasant smoke of tallow. It smelled of honey. It was used in churches at royal events by the wealthy. The bees carved above this door announced something quietly significant. This is a place that works with the finer material, the sweeter light. The narrator pushes gently at the door. It opens without resistance, swinging inward on hinges that are silent. Recently oiled, one suspects, and releasing a wave of warm, scented air that is so inviting, so absolutely specific and unlike anything else that the narrator simply steps inside before thinking about it at all. The door closes softly behind them. The first thing you notice is the warmth. Not the aggressive, overheated warmth of a modern building's central heating, but the deep, radiating warmth of a room that has held a fire for many hours and stored that heat in its stones. The walls are pale plaster over stone, thick enough that the outside world barely penetrates. The floor is flagstone, worn and slightly uneven, with a faded rug the color of old wine stretched across the center of the room. The second thing you notice is the light. There are candles everywhere, not in a chaotic, overwhelming way, but arranged with clear intention. On a long wooden table against the far wall, perhaps a dozen tall tapers stand in iron holders of various heights, their flames burning upright and steady in the still air. On a shelf to the left, shorter pillar candles glow in clusters of 3 and 5. In the corners of the room, deeper candles set in glass containers give off a softer, more diffused light. And hanging from an iron bracket in the ceiling, a chandelier, a simple, honest thing of curved metal, holds 8 candles whose light falls evenly across the whole room. The effect is extraordinary. You forget, perhaps, that you live in a world of electric light until you find yourself in a room lit only by flame, and then you remember, viscerally, somewhere in your body rather than your mind, that this is what light actually is when it is alive. It breathes. It moves. It responds to the air. Shadows shift and settle and shift again. The room is never uniformly bright. It is full of gradations, full of warmth and depth and quiet mystery. The third thing you notice is the man. He is sitting at the long table, bent over some work, and he does not look up immediately when the narrator enters. He is old, or rather, he has the particular quality of someone who has been doing one thing for so long that age and craft have become the same thing. His hands are the first thing you see clearly. They are extraordinary hands, large and capable, with long fingers and the particular kind of callous smoothness that comes from years of working with hot wax. They move with precision and patience over the thing he is doing, which appears to be the trimming of a wick. Snipping it to exactly the right length, not too long, not too short, with a pair of small iron scissors. He wears a plain linen shirt, rolled to the elbows. Around him, the workshop breathes, the smells shifting and layering as the narrator moves slightly, picking up beeswax here, something floral and faint there, the clean mineral scent of fresh wax cooling in a mold across the room. When he finally looks up, his eyes are the color of amber, which seems entirely appropriate. "You found us," he says, in English that is accented but clear, the vowels slightly rounder and more deliberate than an English speaker would make them. He says it not as a question, and not with any particular surprise, but with the simple acknowledgement of someone who expected this to happen eventually. He gestures toward a low wooden stool beside the table. The narrator sits. The candlelight moves. The warmth of the room settles around them like a blanket, and the workshop master begins to talk. "Before we talk about candles," the old man says, setting down his small scissors and resting his remarkable hands flat on the table, "we must talk about what a candle is made of. Because a candle is not simply a wick and a flame. It is wax, first. And wax is where all the character comes from." He stands, moving with the ease and deliberateness of someone who has inhabited their body for a long time and made peace with it, and crosses to a shelf along the left wall, where a row of different materials sit in glass jars and ceramic pots, each labeled in Czech in a small, neat hand. He brings 2 things back to the table and sets them side by side. The first is a block of something pale yellow, almost cream-colored, with a slightly matte surface and a faint, complex smell, something between honey and pollen and the dry warmth of a summer afternoon in a meadow. The second is something whiter and more opaque, with a slightly waxy sheen and, when the narrator leans close, barely any smell at all. Beeswax, the old man says, touching the first. And tallow. He touches the second. Beeswax, he explains, is produced by honeybees, specifically by the worker bees, who secrete it from glands along their abdomens. The bees use it to build the honeycomb cells in which they store honey and raise their young. When beekeepers harvest honey, the wax comes with it, and after the honey is extracted, the wax can be separated, boiled clean, and purified for other uses. Historically, it was collected and purified by boiling it in seawater several times, which drew out impurities and left the wax cleaner and lighter. 1 kilogram of beeswax, the old man notes with a slight emphasis that suggests he finds this remarkable every time he says it, is the material that bees use to store approximately 22 kilograms of honey. It is a substance produced at considerable metabolic cost by the bees, which is part of why it has always been expensive. Beeswax burns cleanly. It produces no acrid smoke, no unpleasant smell. Instead, it releases a gentle, warm, honeyed scent as it melts and burns, and it burns slowly, which means a beeswax candle will outlast a tallow candle of the same size. The Catholic Church, for many centuries, mandated that altar candles be made of beeswax for exactly these reasons: the purity of the burn, the sweetness of the scent, the steadiness of the light. Medieval monks often kept their own apiaries specifically to supply the beeswax their monastery's chapel required. Papal declarations were issued regulating the minimum beeswax content that altar candles must contain. Tallow, by contrast, is rendered animal fat, typically from beef or mutton, boiled and clarified. It was the material of everyday candles for ordinary households throughout medieval Europe, simply because it was available and cheap. Every household that kept animals produced fat, and tallow chandlers would travel from house to house in cities and towns, collecting the kitchen fats that families had saved and making candles from them in exchange for payment or a portion of the candles themselves. It burned adequately, but it smelled a sour, fatty, slightly rancid smell that was simply accepted as the price of light. The famous ordinances banning tallow candle production within certain European city boundaries were not primarily about fire safety, but about the smell, which neighbors found intolerable. By the time medieval Bohemia was at the height of its craft culture, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, when Emperor Charles IV had made Prague one of the most important cities in Europe and the guild system was fully established, the two types of chandler had developed into essentially separate trades. The wax chandlers, who worked with beeswax, were often wealthy and served the church, the nobility, and the affluent merchant class. The tallow chandlers served everyone else. In some cities, laws were actually passed regulating the proportion of tallow that could be included in a candle, the chandler's laws, as they came to be known in England, because the temptation to dilute expensive beeswax with cheaper tallow was apparently irresistible to those whose profit margins were tight. The old man picks up the block of beeswax and holds it toward a nearby candle. In the light, it takes on a richer, deeper color, amber gold, like old honey held up to the sun. This, he says quietly, is still the finest material for a candle. nothing burns quite like it. The narrator watches as the old man moves to another part of the workshop, a lower bench near the fireplace, where several lengths of material lie coiled in loose circles, each one slightly different from the last. Some are thin and pale, almost white. Some are thicker and braided in a tight, regular pattern. Some are twisted loosely, with the individual strands still visible. Wicks, the narrator realizes. These are all wicks. The wick, the old man explains, settling onto a low stool and picking up one of the braided lengths, is not merely a string. It is, in fact, the engine of the candle. Without the wick, you would simply have a block of wax that could not sustain a flame, because liquid wax, on its own, does not burn. Wax must be in its gaseous state before it will ignite. And the wick's entire purpose is to make that transformation happen, repeatedly and continuously, for as long as the candle burns. Here is what the wick actually does. When you light it, the heat of the flame melts the wax immediately around and below it, creating a small pool of liquid. The wick, made of absorbent material, typically braided cotton, though historically hemp and other plant fibers were also used, draws this liquid wax upward through its fibers by a process called capillary action. Capillary action is the same force that allows plants to draw water up from their roots through their stems, or that causes a paper towel to pull liquid inward when you press it to a spill. The liquid moves through narrow spaces and against gravity, drawn by the attractive force between the liquid molecules and the surface of the fibers. As the liquid wax rises through the wick and reaches the flame, the intense heat there, temperatures in a candle flame range from around 800 degrees Celsius in the blue base zone up to around 1,400 degrees Celsius at the very outer edge, vaporizes the liquid wax, turning it into a gas. That gas then reacts with oxygen in the air and combusts, producing heat, light, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. The heat of this combustion then melts more wax below, which is drawn up the wick, which feeds the flame, which melts more wax, a beautiful, self-sustaining cycle that continues until the fuel is exhausted. The wick, therefore, must be exactly right. If it is too thin, it won't draw up enough wax to sustain the flame properly, and the candle will drown in its own melt pool. If it is too thick, it will draw up more wax than the flame can burn, producing smoke and soot and what chandlers call mushrooming at the tip of the wick, a buildup of carbon that causes the flame to flicker and behave erratically. Before the 19th century, one of the important tasks in maintaining a candle was trimming the wick regularly with specially designed scissors called snuffers. As a candle burns, the wick is slowly consumed, but in older candles with certain wick constructions, this didn't happen evenly, and the exposed wick would grow too long as the candle burned, causing the flame to get too large, produce soot, and potentially even become a fire hazard. Wick trimming was a regular domestic task in households that relied on candles for light, just as charging a phone is a regular task in a modern household. Modern candles use braided cotton wicks designed to curl slightly as they burn, which means the tip of the wick is carried into the outer, hottest part of the flame and incinerated, self-trimming, essentially. But in the workshop, the old man prefers to still trim his wicks by hand before each burn, as his teacher taught him, and his teacher's teacher taught before that. The different wicks laid out before the narrator represent different weights and sizes of candle. A thin wick for a slender taper, a thicker braided wick for a wide pillar, a core wick for a container candle. Each has been chosen with precision for the wax it will carry and the flame it will sustain. The narrator picks up one of the slender wicks and rolls it gently between two fingers. It is softer than expected, with a slight give to it. It smells faintly of something. Slightly mineral. Slightly clean. Mordenting, the old man says, watching. The wick has been treated with a solution of borax, sodium borate, which binds to the cellulose fibers and helps form a protective layer of char as it burns. It keeps the wick from burning away too fast. An untreated wick would be consumed by the flame before the candle could finish. The treatment allows the wick to last exactly as long as the candle it carries. The narrator sets the wick down gently. There is something in all of this, in the precision, the balance, the absolute necessity of getting each element exactly right, that is deeply calming. A candle is a system, exquisitely tuned. Nothing in it is accidental. We will make one, the old man says simply, standing and moving to the center of the workshop where a long iron bar has been set horizontally between two supports at approximately chest height. Beneath it, on a low bench, a series of tall, narrow containers, cylindrical, like deep cups, stand in a row, each one holding melted wax that has been kept fluid by a small warming apparatus beneath the bench, a gentle sustained heat no higher than needed. The narrator is handed a length of prepared wick, about the length of their arm, its two ends already stiffened with a first coating of wax to make them manageable. The old man takes one end and loops it over the iron bar so that the wick hangs doubled, two lengths suspended side by side, with perhaps a hand's width between them. "Watch," he says. He takes the bar, gently, using a padded grip, and lowers the two hanging wicks into the nearest container of wax, submerging them completely, then lifts them out in a single, steady, unhurried motion. The wicks emerge coated in a thin layer of translucent, pale yellow beeswax, which begins immediately to firm up in the cooler air of the workshop. "You wait," the old man says, holding the bar steady. "Not long. Until the wax is no longer liquid, but not yet fully hard. You feel for when it has gone from shine to matte. That is the moment." He tilts the bar slightly so the narrator can watch the surface of the wax change. First glossy, liquid sheened, then in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, beginning to lose its reflectiveness, taking on a softer, more opaque quality. The moment he describes is subtle but real. The narrator sees it. Down again into the wax. Up again. Wait. This is the dipping method of candle making, which is among the oldest techniques known and remains, in many traditional workshops, the preferred method for making tapers. Each pass through the wax adds a thin, even layer, a fraction of a millimeter, and with each layer, the candle grows slightly wider, slightly heavier, slightly more itself. To build a proper taper of useful thickness, a chandler might dip the same wick between 20 and 40 times, depending on the wax, the temperature, and the desired final diameter. There is something hypnotic about it. Down and up and wait. down and up and wait. The wax builds in layers like the rings of a tree, each one added with patience, each one adding to the whole. The candle takes its shape gradually, honestly, nothing forced, nothing rushed. The old man does this as naturally as breathing, the motion deeply ingrained over what must be decades of repetition. In the workshops of medieval Bohemia, the old man says conversationally as he works, a chandler's apprentice would spend years learning only this. The dipping, the timing, the feeling of when the wax is ready and when it is not. You cannot learn it from a book. You learn it from the wax, and the wax teaches you slowly. The Prague guilds, of which the candle-making craft was a part, had formal structures that regulated exactly how this learning took place. An apprentice entered the workshop typically as a boy, sometimes as young as 10 or 12 years old, and spent several years doing the most basic tasks, tending fires, cleaning equipment, fetching and carrying, watching everything and asking questions when permitted. Gradually, as trust and skill accumulated, they were given more responsibility. Eventually, after years of apprenticeship and a journeyman period in which they traveled and worked in other workshops to broaden their knowledge, they might produce a masterwork, a piece of craftsmanship submitted to the guild masters for evaluation. If it passed, they could establish their own workshop and take on their own apprentices. This was not a quick process. It was designed to ensure that the craft was passed on with full integrity, not just the technique, but the understanding behind the technique, the accumulated knowledge of why each step matters and what happens when it goes wrong. Down and up and wait. The candle is becoming something. The old man sets the growing candle aside to cool and reaches for a finished one, a tall, slender taper of deep gold, perfectly smooth-sided, tapering gently from a wider base to a narrow, precise tip. He carries it to the table and settles it into an iron holder. Then, from his shirt pocket, he produces a small box of matches, wooden matches, the long kind with dark red heads. He strikes one. The brief, bright flare softens almost immediately into the steady, living light of a candle flame. He sets the match down on a small ceramic plate to cool and settles back onto his stool. "Watch the flame," he says. A candle flame, it turns out, is one of the most extraordinary things you can observe if you slow down enough to actually see it. At the very base, where the flame meets the tip of the wick, there is a zone of blue, a blue that is often overlooked because the eye is drawn to the brighter, warmer colors above. This blue zone is where the supply of oxygen is richest and combustion is most complete. The temperatures here are around 800 degrees Celsius. This is where the heat that melts the surrounding wax primarily comes from. Moving upward into the body of the flame, the color shifts through orange to yellow, the familiar warm tones of candlelight. This is the luminous zone, the part that produces the light we actually see. The yellow color comes from tiny particles of carbon, heated to such extreme temperatures that they begin to glow, a phenomenon called incandescence, the same principle that once made the filaments of incandescent light bulbs glow. These carbon particles are heated to approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius in this part of the flame. The very outermost edge of the flame, the veil, in some technical descriptions, is the hottest part of all, reaching around 1,400 degrees Celsius, though this zone produces relatively little of the visible light. The shape of the flame, that characteristic elongated teardrop, is not accidental. It is produced by convection. The heat of the combustion creates a rising column of hot gas and air above the flame, and fresh, cooler, oxygen-rich air is drawn in from the sides and below. This convective flow shapes the flame and continuously supplies it with the oxygen it needs. If you remove the oxygen, cover the candle with a glass jar, as the old man now demonstrates with a clear glass vessel he places over the flame. The flame shrinks rapidly, flickers, and within about 15 to 30 seconds, depending on the size of the jar, goes out. Remove the jar at the very last moment, when the flame has shrunk to almost nothing, and it will briefly flare back to life before fading, the last of the available oxygen spent. And then there is the phenomenon that never quite loses its wonder, no matter how many times you see it. If you blow out a candle and then hold a lit match not to the wick itself, but to the thin thread of white smoke that rises from the extinguished wick, the flame will travel down the smoke, down the column of vaporized wax still hovering in the air, and relight the wick from a distance, sometimes as much as several centimeters away. The white smoke is not carbon smoke, but condensed droplets of wax vapor, still flammable, still capable of carrying a flame. Michael Faraday, the great English scientist, gave a famous series of lectures in 1860 titled The Chemical History of a Candle, in which he used the simple burning of a candle to illuminate dozens of scientific principles for a general audience. It was considered one of the finest examples of scientific communication ever produced. The idea that a single candle, examined carefully and patiently, could teach you fundamental truths about chemistry, physics, and the nature of matter itself. The candle on the table burns. The flame stands upright and still in the workshop's quiet air. The light it casts is warm and alive and moves with the subtle currents that the narrator's breathing creates in the room. A candle, the old man says, watching it with them, is never perfectly still. It is always responding
To the air.
to the room, to the person watching it. The old man rises again, and this time goes to a different shelf, not the one with the wax samples, but one deeper in the workshop, behind a half-drawn curtain of rough linen. He returns to the table with an armful of small glass jars and a few paper-wrapped bundles of dried plant material, which he sets out with the unhurried calm of someone arranging something they have arranged many times before and find pleasure in still. The jars contain essential oils, small quantities, each capped tightly to preserve the volatile compounds inside. The old man uncaps one and holds it toward the narrator. The smell that rises is bright and floral and immediately recognizable, lavender. Then he caps it and opens another, something warmer and more complex, linden blossom, he says, also called lime blossom in some traditions, one of the most beloved scents in Central European folk memory. The linden tree, or lipa in Czech, is considered by many to be the national tree of the Czech lands, appearing in folk songs, poetry, and the names of villages across Bohemia and Moravia. Then he opens a third jar. This one smells like rain-washed forest, like resin and something green and something ancient. For resin, he says, from the Samava Mountains. personally felt experiences in human neuroscience. The olfactory nerve, the nerve that carries information about smell, connects directly to the limbic system, the part of the brain most closely associated with memory and emotion. Unlike sight or sound, which pass through several relay stations before reaching the brain's emotional processing centers, smell takes a more direct route. This is why a particular scent can produce a fully formed, emotionally vivid memory in the space of a heartbeat, not a thought about the memory, but the feeling of it, immediate and complete. The smell of a grandparent's kitchen, the smell of a particular season, the smell of somewhere you were happy long ago. The Chandlers of Old Bohemia worked with fragrance partly for practical reasons. Scented candles made from beeswax already carried the natural honey sweetness of the wax itself, but added botanicals could mask or enhance this, or give the candle a specific character. Lavender, used across Central Europe, was understood to promote calm and ease restlessness. Linden blossom had long associations with relaxation and mild sedation. Linden blossom tea was a traditional remedy for tension and sleeplessness throughout Bohemia and across much of Central Europe. Rosemary was thought to aid memory and mental clarity. Rose petals and chamomile were associated with peace and softness. The old man is now preparing a small batch of scented wax, melting a portion of his beeswax in a heavy-bottomed pot over a low flame on the workshop's hearth, keeping the temperature steady. Beeswax melts at around 62 to 64 degrees Celsius, considerably higher than, say, soy wax, which melts in the range of 46 to 54 degrees, or paraffin, which varies but generally melts between 46 and 68 degrees, depending on grade. The higher melting point of beeswax is one of its great advantages. Beeswax candles hold their shape better in warm conditions and don't soften on a summer's day the way cheaper wax candles sometimes do. When the wax is fully liquid and clear, the old man removes the pot from the heat and waits a short while. Essential oil added to wax that is too hot will simply evaporate before it can be incorporated. The volatile compounds driven off by the heat before they have a chance to be captured in the wax. He watches the temperature with a small thermometer, and when it reaches his preferred point, he adds a measured amount of linden blossom oil to the liquid wax, stirring slowly and gently with a slender wooden rod. The workshop fills with the scent. It is extraordinary. The beeswax honey warmth mixed now with the linden blossom's softer, more floral sweetness, and something else underneath both of them, something that the narrator can't quite name, but that feels like summer evenings when they were very young, when everything was simpler. Scent in a candle, the old man says, still stirring slowly, is not decoration. It is communication. You are telling the person who lights this candle something about what the moment should feel like. After the scented wax is poured into its waiting molds, long, tapered mold forms of polished tin that stand upright in a rack along the wall, each one threaded through the bottom with a prepared wick, the old man brings the narrator to a different corner of the workshop, one they hadn't fully explored yet. Here, on a low bench with good light from a cluster of candles overhead, sits a collection of small containers. Some are glass, some ceramic, some folded paper. And inside each one, a different color. Not the artificial brightness of synthetic dyes, but deeper, more complex tones. Ochre yellow, warm red, almost russet, a dark blue-green that might be verdigris, a soft rose, a deep, mossy green. Natural dyes, the old man explains, used historically to give candles color, for practical and symbolic reasons both. In medieval Europe, the color of a candle at a ceremony, a funeral, a wedding, a church service, was not arbitrary. It carried meaning. White or near-white candles, often achieved with highly purified beeswax or with bleached materials, were associated with purity, with mourning in some traditions, and with the sacred. Red candles were associated with life force, with warmth, with protection. Yellow, the natural color of unbleached beeswax, carried associations of sunlight and honey. Purple was the color of royalty and of Advent. Green was associated with renewal and hope. Black was used in some mourning traditions, though rarely, as it required substantial quantities of dye that were difficult and expensive to produce before synthetic chemistry. The dyes themselves came from wherever the natural world offered them. The ochre yellow might be achieved with onion skins, still one of the most effective natural fabric and wax dyes, requiring no mordant and producing a warm, lasting color. The russet red might come from madder root, used across Europe for red dye for thousands of years. The blue-green could be achieved with copper compounds. The rose from certain flower petals or berries. Some coloring agents were rarer and more expensive. Saffron, for a bright gold, was extraordinarily costly and used only in the finest candles. The old man lifts the lid from one of the small ceramic pots. Inside, a deep crimson powder that smells faintly earthy and complex. Dragon's blood, he says, not from a dragon, but from the resin of a tree, used across the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern craft traditions for centuries as both a red dye and a varnish, carried north through trade routes to eventually appear in workshops like this one. Color in a candle, he says, replacing the lid, does not change how the candle burns, but it changes how the candle is received. A red candle on a feast table is a different statement than a white one. Both burn the same way, but the person who looks at them does not feel the same way. There is something in this that the narrator turns over quietly. The idea that the same function, producing light and warmth, can carry different emotional weight depending on what color it wears. A candle is both a fact and a feeling. It is both chemistry and ceremony. The workshop holds both of those things at once. And somehow, in the warmth and the golden light, that seems entirely natural. The old man goes to a chest of drawers in the corner, a heavy, dark wood piece, old enough to have no maker's mark visible anywhere, and from the middle drawer produces something wrapped carefully in linen. He unwraps it with the practiced, gentle movements of someone who handles it often but always with respect, and what is revealed is a sheet of parchment, brownish at the edges, with writing in check in a hand that curves and decorates itself with small flourishes. A description, the old man says, of a local candle tradition. Promness. Celebrated on the 2nd of February each year, Promness is the Czech name for what Christians call Candlemas, the feast day that commemorates the presentation of Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem, 40 days after Christmas. But Hromnis carries something older underneath its Christian meaning, something that connects it to the pre-Christian recognition of that point in the year when winter has passed its midpoint and the light is genuinely beginning to return. The Czech name derives from Hromniky, a specific type of blessed candle, named from the Czech word Rom, meaning thunder. These candles were brought to church on the 2nd of February, blessed by a priest during the Candlemas Mass, and then carried home with enormous care. They were not burned decoratively. They were kept, placed behind portraits of the saints, hidden in a particular drawer, held in readiness for serious need. When a storm gathered and thunder threatened, a Hromniky would be lit and placed in the window, believed to protect the household from the lightning and thunder that the name invokes. When a family member fell seriously ill, the blessed candle would be lit during prayers for their recovery. When someone was dying, the candle would be brought to the bedside, lit, its light accompanying the person through that final passage. A Czech saying recorded about this tradition goes, Na Hromnis o hodinu vice, on Hromnis an hour more, meaning that on this day, the light has already lengthened by 1 hour compared to the depths of midwinter. The Candle Festival, in this sense, is also a celebration of the returning light, of winter's hold beginning to loosen, of the days growing longer in increments so small you can barely see them but can somehow feel. Across Europe, the Candlemas tradition took different forms. In France and Belgium, crepes were made and eaten, round and golden, the shape and color of the sun, connecting the candle festival to the return of warmth and light. In some parts of Germany and Switzerland, children would carry lanterns through the streets, singing and collecting sweets from neighbors, a practice that has clear echoes in much later Halloween traditions in other parts of the world. In Scandinavia, Candlemas traditions blended with midwinter light customs that acknowledged the extreme darkness of northern winters and the necessity of marking each step toward the longer days. And in Czech families, there was another candle tradition entirely separate from Hromnis, one associated with Christmas Eve. Czech families would take walnut shells, half a shell per person, and set a small stub of candle in each one. On Christmas Eve, these tiny floating candles would be placed in a basin of water and lit, and the family would gather to watch. Whether your candle burned steadily or guttered, whether it drifted toward another or moved away, whether it stayed afloat or sank, all of these were read as signs about the year ahead. Children in particular were fascinated, watching their walnut candle with the intense seriousness that children bring to things they believe in completely. The old man folds the parchment back into its linen with care and returns it to the drawer. A candle at a festival is not the same candle as one on a table, he says, settling back down. The ceremony makes it something more. People know this even if they cannot explain it. They have always known it. The old man stands and moves to the single window of the workshop. Not a large window, set deep into the stone wall at roughly chest height, its small panes of old glass slightly uneven, giving the view a gentle waviness, as if seen through slow water. Outside, the evening has fully arrived. The sky above the rooftops is the deep violet blue of a clear autumn night in Central Europe, and already a few stars are visible. The silhouette of a steeple, one of the many that give Prague's skyline its extraordinary character, rises against that blue. The cobblestones below catch what light there is and give it back in scattered silver pieces. Before electricity arrived in Prague, and it arrived in stages, beginning in the late 19th century, with the city's first electric streetlights appearing in the 1880s, the entire old town would have looked something like this at night, only darker. Not completely dark. The streets were lit, but with torches and lanterns and, yes, candles, and the character of a city lit by flame is entirely different from a city lit by electricity. Flame is directional. It casts a warm circle of light that falls off rapidly in all directions, so that you move through pools of illumination separated by genuine darkness. In medieval and early modern Prague, the wealthy had candles inside their homes. Beeswax for those who could afford it, tallow for everyone else. Inns and taverns burned candles or oil lamps. Churches blazed with dozens or hundreds of candles for high festivals. But the streets themselves, outside the pools of the occasional torch bracket or a lantern hung from a building corner, were dark in a way that is almost impossible to imagine today. This darkness shaped urban life profoundly. Evening activities, once the candles inside homes were lit, were constrained by the cost of the light and the quality of the illumination. Reading required good light, enough candles, close enough to the page. Fine needlework or detailed craft required the same. Gathering to talk and eat and drink was easier, since the minimum candlelight was sufficient for that. Activities that could be done by touch or memory, spinning, certain kinds of weaving, storytelling, could continue into the evening without much light at all. The candle was also a timekeeper. Before reliable mechanical clocks were available to ordinary households, candles marked time with reasonable accuracy. A chandler could make candles calibrated to burn for a specific number of hours, marked at intervals, and these candle clocks were used in households and monasteries and government buildings across medieval Europe. The passage of time was literally illuminated, the candle shortening hour by hour, the flame gradually descending through the marked divisions until it reached its end. It is said that King Alfred the Great of England used candle clocks in the 9th century to divide his day into equal portions: 8 hours for God and learning, 8 hours for governance, and 8 hours for sleep. Whether this is precisely true is uncertain, but the association of candles with the measurement of time was common enough that the idea would have seemed entirely natural to his contemporaries. You stands beside the old man at the window, both of them looking out at the Prague night. The rooftops are dark against the sky. The steeple holds its point of silhouette. Somewhere below, the Vltava River moves through its banks, carrying the city's reflection in its current. Before the lights, the old man says, you saw the city differently. Every window was a candle. Every candle was a person inside going about their evening. You could almost feel the warmth of the city by looking at its windows. They leave the workshop for a short while, the old man producing a lantern from near the door, a proper old lantern with a real candle inside it, protected by glass panels from the night air, and walk together through the narrow lanes toward the river. The Vltava, the Czech national river. It flows through Prague for 31 kilometers, crossed by 18 bridges. The word Vltava is believed to come from Old Germanic words meaning wild water, and while the Vltava is generally a benign and beautiful presence through the city, its history includes devastating floods in 1784, 1845, 1890, and most catastrophically in 2002, when water reached over 7 meters above normal levels and caused enormous damage. The river has always had two faces: the generous provider of trade routes, drinking water and transport, and the wild water of its name, capable of reminding the city of its power. The prophetess Libusz, in the founding legend of Prague, stood at the cliff of Vyšehrad above the Vltava in the 7th century and declared, "I see a great city whose glory will touch the stars." The river was always part of that vision. The city and the river are inseparable, each one shaping and reflecting the other for more than 1,000 years. At night, the Vltava does something remarkable. It holds the light of the city on its surface, or rather, it holds what light there is and distributes it across its moving water so that the reflections of buildings and bridges and lamps are not fixed and clear but rippling, shifting, broken, and remade continuously with each small wave. Standing at the bank on a night like this one, the lantern casting its small warm circle over the cobblestones at the water's edge, the effect is like looking at a painting of the city done in a medium that never quite dries. The old man reaches into the deep pocket of his coat and produces two small objects, walnut shells, each one holding a tiny stub of candle. He lights them from the lantern, the flames rising small and steady, and kneels to set them on the water at the river's edge. For a moment, they simply float, bright and still in the sheltered air by the bank. Then a slight movement in the water catches them and carries them, two small lights drifting out into the dark river, moving together at first, then gradually parting as currents take them separately. The Czechs have their walnut shell candles at Christmas, but the act of releasing a light onto moving water is older and wider than any single tradition. Rivers have been sites for candle and lamp offerings across many cultures and times. In parts of East and Southeast Asia, the practice of setting floating lights on water for ceremonies of remembrance and hope is ancient and still deeply alive. The symbolism is consistent everywhere. The water carries the light forward, into the dark, beyond where the eye can follow. It is an act of both release and trust. The two walnut candles drift further out. The narrator watches them until they are very small, two trembling sparks in the dark river, barely visible, then gone. The old man is quiet for a long moment. "The river takes things," he says finally, "and the river brings things. It has always been both." Back in the warmth of the workshop, the lantern returned to its hook by the door. The narrator settles again onto the low stool and watches the old man move through his space with the ease of someone moving through their own mind. Each section of the workshop corresponds to a stage or aspect of the craft, and he navigates between them the way you navigate a familiar room in the dark, by memory and feel, by the accumulated knowledge of where everything is and how everything connects. This is how candle-making knowledge was transmitted for most of human history. Not through books. The majority of craftspeople in medieval Europe were not literate, and written technical manuals for trades like candle making were rare and often incomplete. Knowledge lived in bodies and hands and memories. It was transmitted through demonstration and repetition, through the master showing and the apprentice watching and then doing, through the correction of errors in real time, and the gradual refinement of feel. The guild system was, in this sense, an extraordinarily effective technology for the preservation and transmission of craft knowledge. Within the guild structure, a master craftsman had both the incentive and the obligation to teach properly. Improperly trained craftsmen reflected badly on the guild as a whole, and the guild's reputation was the source of its economic power. The guild set standards for product quality, investigated complaints from customers, and could revoke the membership, and therefore the operating license, of craftsmen who produced inferior work. This accountability structure meant that the knowledge being transmitted was the real, complete, tested knowledge, not a simplified version or a shortcut. The apprenticeship was also a relationship, and like all relationships, it was complex. Some masters were generous teachers who shared everything they knew. Others were more protective of particular techniques or formulas, especially those that gave them a competitive edge, a specific blend of wax and tallow, a particular method of incorporating fragrance, a way of finishing the surface of a candle that gave it a superior appearance. These protected knowledges were sometimes lost when a master died without a willing heir or a trusted apprentice. Other times, they were preserved precisely because someone had watched carefully enough and long enough to absorb what was never formally taught. The old man reaches beneath the table and produces a small bound book, not very old, judging by its appearance, but handwritten in a cramped, careful script with occasional sketches in the margins. His own workshop notes, he says, begun when he was himself an apprentice in the city, watching his own master work. He shows the narrator one page, a drawing of a wick cross-section with measurements and annotations about braiding tightness. Another page shows a table of temperatures for different wax types. Another, a list of fragrance combinations and the occasions he used them for. Everything I know that I could write down, I wrote down, he says. But there is more that I could not write. How the wax feels when it is ready. How the workshop sounds when a candle is burning correctly. What your hands know that your mind does not. He sets the book back carefully. The candles on the table burn steadily. The workshop breathes. Some knowledge can only be transmitted by being in the room, he says. By watching. By doing. That is why you are here. You have been in the workshop for how long? It is impossible to say. Time in this room does not move quite the way it does outside. The rhythm of the candles, the slowness of the work, the warmth and the scent, all of these conspire to produce a state in which the usual markers of time become less relevant. It is not late. It is not early. It is simply the time of the workshop, which is its own kind of time. The old man is now working on finishing, the final stage of making a candle before it is considered complete. The dipped tapers they made earlier have cooled and been removed from the iron bar, their doubled lengths separated into individual candles by cutting the looped top. Each one now stands approximately 30 centimeters tall, creamy gold, perfectly smooth on their surfaces. But the old man examines each one carefully, turning it slowly in his fingers under the light of a cluster of candles, looking for imperfections, any small bubble or crack in the surface, any irregularity in the taper. These imperfections matter more than aesthetics. A surface crack in a candle means the wax layers didn't adhere properly, and when the candle burns and the wax pool reaches that layer, the candle may burn unevenly, or the surface may split, or the liquid wax may run down the side unpredictably. A properly made dipped taper, by contrast, burns evenly from the top down, the wax pool staying level and clean, the wick consuming itself at exactly the right rate. He finds one candle with a tiny imperfection near its base, barely visible, but real. He dips it once more into the warm wax, a final pass, and lifts it out. The imperfection disappears under the new thin layer. The candle is now exactly right. The wick trimming comes next. Each wick is trimmed with the small iron scissors to precisely 1/4 of an inch, the length that allows the flame to stabilize quickly and burn without producing excess smoke or soot. Too long a wick produces a large, flickering, smoky flame. Too short produces a flame that struggles to establish itself and may drown in the melt pool before it is time to burn cleanly. You watch this trimming with a kind of meditative attention. Each snip is exactly right. The old man does a measure. He sees it the way a musician hears a note that is slightly flat before they could explain what they hear. The knowledge is in the eye, in the hand, in the accumulated thousands of hours of doing this specific thing in this specific way. Finishing, the old man says, setting a completed candle carefully into a holder, is where you show how much you care. Anyone can dip a wick in wax and call it a candle. To make a candle that burns perfectly, that serves the person who lights it completely and without trouble, that lasts exactly as long as it should and leaves nothing wasted, that takes attention. That takes respect for the material, for the person who will use it, and for the craft itself. He lines the finished candles in a row, 12 of them, identical in height and diameter, each one a slightly different shade of gold, depending on the exact batch of beeswax that formed its outer layers. In the candlelight, they glow with their own reflected warmth, the smooth wax surfaces picking up the light and holding it. You think, these will be lit in some home by some person who bought them without thinking particularly about what went into them. They will burn for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, depending on where they are kept and how the air moves in the room. And they will produce light, real, living, moving, breathing light, the same light that human beings have been producing for thousands of years. The light that made the evenings of medieval Prague soft and golden. The light that blessed the Chromniki candles on Candlemas morning. The light that drifted down the Vltava in walnut shells on Christmas Eve. Something very old and very continuous. Nothing interrupted. The night outside has deepened. The old man has not looked at a clock or a watch. There does not appear to be either in the workshop, and neither has the narrator. The fire on the hearth has been fed once and is burning steadily, its warmth mixing with the warmth of the dozens of candles until the room has reached a temperature that is exactly right for neither waking nor sleeping, but for something in between. The old man makes tea. He boils water on the hearth in a small blackened kettle and pours it over linden blossom dried from the previous summer, the same fragrance whose oil went into the scented wax earlier, now soft and floral in the steam. He hands the narrator a ceramic mug, wide and slightly irregular, obviously handmade. The tea smells like the workshop. The workshop smells like the tea. Everything in here belongs to a single coherent world. People ask me, the old man says, cradling his own mug, why candles? When there is electricity, when there is everything modern, why this old thing? He pauses, and the candles on the table burn between them. I think it is because a candle does not pretend to be more than it is. It is a small fire on a wick. It gives what it has, which is warmth and light and a few hours. It does not promise anything beyond that. And when it has given everything it has, it is gone. The symbolism of candles runs through human culture so widely and deeply that to trace all of it would take a lifetime. In Christianity, the candle represents Christ as the light of the world. In Jewish tradition, the Hanukkah menorah's lights celebrate the miracle of oil that lasted 8 days. In Buddhism and Hinduism, oil lamps and candles are offered at shrines and temples as acts of devotion and as symbols of the light of wisdom dispelling the darkness of ignorance. In secular modern culture, birthday candles are blown out as wishes are made, a ritual whose origin is genuinely uncertain but which connects to ancient beliefs about smoke carrying prayers upward, about light and breath and intention together. The candle at a vigil for the dead. The candle lit during a power outage. The candle at a romantic dinner. The candle beside a meditation cushion. The candle in the hospital room. The candle in the church at Christmas. You think, these will be lit in some home by some person who bought them without thinking particularly about what went into them. They will burn for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, depending on where they are kept and how the air moves in the room. And they will produce light, real, living, moving, breathing light, the same light that human beings have been producing for thousands of years. The light that made the evenings of medieval Prague soft and golden. The light that blessed the Chromniki candles on Candlemas morning. The light that drifted down the Vltava in walnut shells on Christmas Eve. Something very old and very continuous. Nothing interrupted. The night outside has deepened. The old man has not looked at a clock or a watch. There does not appear to be either in the workshop, and neither has the narrator. The fire on the hearth has been fed once and is burning steadily, its warmth mixing with the warmth of the dozens of candles until the room has reached a temperature that is exactly right for neither waking nor sleeping, but for something in between. The old man makes tea. He boils water on the hearth in a small blackened kettle and pours it over linden blossom dried from the previous summer, the same fragrance whose oil went into the scented wax earlier, now soft and floral in the steam. He hands the narrator a ceramic mug, wide and slightly irregular, obviously handmade. The tea smells like the workshop. The workshop smells like the tea. Everything in here belongs to a single coherent world. People ask me, the old man says, cradling his own mug, why candles? When there is electricity, when there is everything modern, why this old thing? He pauses, and the candles on the table burn between them. I think it is because a candle does not pretend to be more than it is. It is a small fire on a wick. It gives what it has, which is warmth and light and a few hours. It does not promise anything beyond that. And when it has given everything it has, it is gone. The symbolism of candles runs through human culture so widely and deeply that to trace all of it would take a lifetime. In Christianity, the candle represents Christ as the light of the world. In Jewish tradition, the Hanukkah menorah's lights celebrate the miracle of oil that lasted 8 days. In Buddhism and Hinduism, oil lamps and candles are offered at shrines and temples as acts of devotion and as symbols of the light of wisdom dispelling the darkness of ignorance. In secular modern culture, birthday candles are blown out as wishes are made, a ritual whose origin is genuinely uncertain but which connects to ancient beliefs about smoke carrying prayers upward, about light and breath and intention together. The candle at a vigil for the dead. The candle lit during a power outage. The candle at a romantic dinner. The candle beside a meditation cushion. The candle in the hospital room. The candle in the church at Christmas. You think, these will be lit in some home by some person who bought them without thinking particularly about what went into them. They will burn for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, depending on where they are kept and how the air moves in the room. And they will produce light, real, living, moving, breathing light, the same light that human beings have been producing for thousands of years. The light that made the evenings of medieval Prague soft and golden. The light that blessed the Chromniki candles on Candlemas morning. The light that drifted down the Vltava in walnut shells on Christmas Eve. Something very old and very continuous. Nothing interrupted. The night outside has deepened. The old man has not looked at a clock or a watch. There does not appear to be either in the workshop, and neither has the narrator. The fire on the hearth has been fed once and is burning steadily, its warmth mixing with the warmth of the dozens of candles until the room has reached a temperature that is exactly right for neither waking nor sleeping, but for something in between. The old man makes tea. He boils water on the hearth in a small blackened kettle and pours it over linden blossom dried from the previous summer, the same fragrance whose oil went into the scented wax earlier, now soft and floral in the steam. He hands the narrator a ceramic mug, wide and slightly irregular, obviously handmade. The tea smells like the workshop. The workshop smells like the tea. Everything in here belongs to a single coherent world. People ask me, the old man says, cradling his own mug, why candles? When there is electricity, when there is everything modern, why this old thing? He pauses, and the candles on the table burn between them. I think it is because a candle does not pretend to be more than it is. It is a small fire on a wick. It gives what it has, which is warmth and light and a few hours. It does not promise anything beyond that. And when it has given everything it has, it is gone. The symbolism of candles runs through human culture so widely and deeply that to trace all of it would take a lifetime. In Christianity, the candle represents Christ as the light of the world. In Jewish tradition, the Hanukkah menorah's lights celebrate the miracle of oil that lasted 8 days. In Buddhism and Hinduism, oil lamps and candles are offered at shrines and temples as acts of devotion and as symbols of the light of wisdom dispelling the darkness of ignorance. In secular modern culture, birthday candles are blown out as wishes are made, a ritual whose origin is genuinely uncertain but which connects to ancient beliefs about smoke carrying prayers upward, about light and breath and intention together. The candle at a vigil for the dead. The candle lit during a power outage. The candle at a romantic dinner. The candle beside a meditation cushion. The candle in the hospital room. The candle in the church at Christmas. Each context is different, but the candle brings something consistent to all of them, a quality of attention, of intimacy, of the present moment made slightly more real and vivid by the presence of a living flame. Michael Faraday, in his famous lectures, noted that a candle burning in a quiet room produces almost no smoke. It is, he said, an extraordinarily efficient combustion machine. And yet we never look at a candle and think of efficiency. We think of something else entirely. We think of peace, of warmth, of the particular quality of an evening that is slowing down and becoming itself. The candle, the old man says, knows only how to give light. It does not know how to hoard it. Every candle, from the moment it is lit, is becoming smaller. And in that becoming smaller, it fills the room. There is no adding to this. The narrator sits with it. The tea is warm in their hands. The fire breathes on the hearth. The candles burn. When the time comes to leave, and the narrator knows it the way you know these things, not by looking at a clock, but by the feeling of something complete, the old man stands and goes once more to the shelf with the finished candles. He selects one, not the largest, not the most elaborate, but a particular one that he seems to have had in mind for some time. It is a pillar candle, wider than the tapers, the color of deep amber honey, faintly scented, linden blossom. The narrator now knows, and beautifully smooth. He wraps it in a square of linen tied with a length of undyed thread. He holds it out. You take it with both hands. It is surprisingly heavy for its size. The density of good beeswax, compressed into its shape by patient, layered dipping and finishing. It is warm from the workshop. When you light it, the old man says, light it slowly. Watch it for the first few minutes, until the flame stabilizes. Then the room will settle, and you will settle with it. You walk back through the workshop, the long table with its candles still burning, the shelf of wax and dye and fragrance, the bench with its coiled wicks, the hearth, and reaches the small carved door. The bees above the lintel, the flame at the center. The dark wood worn smooth by generations of hands. They push it open and step back into Prague.
The city has not changed.
Of course it hasn't. Cities don't change in the space of an evening in the workshop. But the narrator sees it differently now, which amounts to much the same thing. The cobblestones underfoot have been here for centuries. The stone facades of the buildings on either side have absorbed the warmth and cold of 1,000 winters and 1,000 summers. The narrow sky visible between the rooftops above is the same sky that medieval chandlers saw when they carried their candles home at the end of a day's work, the same sky that apprentices looked up at from the workshop doorway while they waited for the wax to cool. Prague has survived things that would have destroyed cities with less deep a foundation. The Hussite wars of the 15th century, which left marks on its churches and public spaces. The 30 Years' War, which scarred much of Central Europe. the occupation of the 20th century, which imposed its own enormous weight on the city and its people. And through all of it, the old town has remained, its streets still following the same medieval paths, its buildings still pressed together in the same intimate, slightly chaotic arrangement, its characters still something that can only be called irreducibly Prague. The astronomical clock on the old town square, built in 1410, still marks the hours with its mechanical figures. The Charles Bridge, begun in 1357 under Charles IV, still spans the Vltava. The Vltava itself flows north through the city as it always has, wild water running tame between its stone banks, carrying the city's reflection on its surface every night. And somewhere in the city, in workshops and studios and small production rooms, people still make candles by hand. They melt beeswax in heavy pots and dip prepared wicks in the old patient rhythm. They add essential oils and natural dyes and press their own understanding of what light and scent and warmth can mean into each thing they make. The craft is not dead. It has never been dead. It has simply moved from the guild workshops of the 14th century to the craft studios of the 21st, carried in the hands and the knowledge of people who understood that some things are worth the slowness they require. You walk through the lane where the workshop is and pauses to look back. The door is there, the carved wooden door with the bees and the flame. From underneath it, a thin line of amber light. From behind it, the faint, warm, honeyed smell of beeswax and linden blossom and something old and good and patient. They hold the wrapped candle against their chest. Prague closes around them, dark and beautiful, lit by its thousands of electric lights, and underneath all of that brightness, somehow, still itself, still the city that Libius saw from the cliff of Visegrad in the 7th century, the city whose glory, she said, would touch the stars. This is, perhaps, the simplest part of the story, and in its simplicity, it is the best. Some evening not long after, in some room somewhere that is not Prague but is wherever you are, you light the candle the old man gave them. They unwrap the linen carefully, because the wrapping is itself a thoughtful thing and deserves respect. They set the candle in a holder, something sturdy, something that won't tip, and they strike a match. The flame catches the wick on the first try. Of course it does. The wick was trimmed correctly, and the wax is good, and the candle knows its work. For the first moments, as the old man said, you watch. The flame stabilizes, moves from its initial slight uncertainty into its proper steady shape, that elongated teardrop of warm light. The blue base appears, then the full luminous yellow-orange above it. The small pool of liquid wax begins to form around the base of the wick, the beeswax melting at its precise 62 or 63 degrees, the wick drawing the liquid upward by capillary action, the vaporized wax reacting with oxygen at the flame's edge, the entire self-sustaining cycle beginning. The room settles. The shadows shift. The quality of light changes, becomes warmer, deeper, more alive. And the smell comes, gradually, as the wax begins to warm fully throughout the candle. Linden blossom, soft and floral and slightly sweet, and underneath it, the deeper honey warmth of the beeswax itself. You settle. Maybe you are that narrator. Maybe you are lying somewhere right now with your eyes closed, the story moving through you like warm water. And you are in the workshop, just for these last moments. The candles burning, the old man sitting at his table, the bees carved above the door, the Vltava moving dark and slow through the city outside.
You do not have to do anything with this.
You do not have to remember it or hold it or carry it anywhere. You can simply let it be here for a while and then let it go the way the walnut shell candles go, downstream, into the dark, out of sight, into whatever comes next. The candle burns. The flame is steady. The room is warm. And you are exactly where you need to be.
Sleep now.
The workshop is still there. The wax is still warm. The old man is still at his table, trimming wicks with his small iron scissors, one by one. Exactly right. Good night.